Lynn Hunt, which you probably guessed. While we're finishing up doing this, I'm going to play a selection from Handel's Messiah. It's actually the Hallelujah Chorus because that was the easiest thing I could find on YouTube. The point of this music I will talk about as soon as you get a chance to listen to it. Okay, we start with this piece of music. Everyone knows that it's Handel's Messiah because I already told you it was Handel's Messiah. Does anybody know what the form is of the music? Is it a symphony? Does anyone know what it is? No singers here? Well, there was a chorus singing. It's called an oratorio, invented by Handel in 1741. I pick it because it comes in the middle of the 18th century where we're going to start this course. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But let me first say a few things about the course to get us going. I will start each lecture with a piece of music from the period and talk about how it is relevant to the period. And I will come back to Handel in a moment. We will, of course, when we get to the modern period, have photographs after the beginning of the 19th century, and we will certainly have videos, films, parts of movies, parts of DVDs, various things as we go along. Now, so I want to talk about the course in general today, and I also want to introduce some of the main themes. Is there anybody in this class who was in the cluster I taught in the fall on modern thought? Oh, okay. You come and see me afterwards and remind me of who you are. I know this is a big class, but we're going to make every effort to get to know each other. I will try to get to know your names, and I will be starting off the class once I figure out how to work all the equipment, which is always a challenge at the beginning. I will be coming around getting you to introduce yourselves individually to me so that I can get to know you myself. Now, the course is going to be available, as I said, on audio podcast, video podcast, YouTube, and so your first question might be, especially those of you who hate to get up in the morning, why can't I just watch you from my dorm room at 9:30 in the morning? Well, you can't. You could if you were able to stay in your dorm room, but it's different to actually be here. I know there's a lot of you, and I know you've had big lecture classes where the idea is it's okay for the first 10 or 15 minutes. It gets a little boring. Why couldn't we just do the material on our own? One, because I know, knowing myself, you won't do it that way. I listen to audio podcasts when I go to the gym, it's true. But I listen to audio podcasts in French so that I can keep up my French, and it's about French history, and so that's better than just being on the treadmill looking at the TV screen, you would admit. But you probably don't go to the gym often enough or long enough to be able to do the audio podcasts or the video podcasts, if you have the means, while you are at the gym. And it's just going to be different in the room. I want you to participate. I want you to ask questions. I want you to get as involved as you can get involved at 9:30 in the morning. So, to that end, there will be, as I said on the syllabus, in-class quizzes. Once a week, not this week, starting next week, once a week, either on Tuesday or on Thursday. They're not going to be tricky. They're not going to be wildly specific. The first one will be a map quiz, and you will be asked to identify the major European countries at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. We're not going to ask you about principalities in Italy. We're going to stick with the biggies: the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, Spain, etc. I'll give you an alert the week ahead of time, most of the time, about what the quiz will be about, whether it's going to be about a document. I'll probably tell you which document it will be. So, in general, my take on this course is the following. 1, I assume that you are incredibly smart. I assume this because you're at UCLA, which is incredibly hard to get into. So I know you're incredibly smart. I assume that you're really excited to be here because UCLA is one of the greatest universities in the world. The history department at UCLA is one of the greatest history departments, not just in the United States, but in the world. So I'm lucky to have you, and you're lucky to be at UCLA. This is an incredibly exciting and problematic period of time that we're going to be talking about in this course. Must read it. It is not terribly overwhelming. How many people took AP European History? Aha, see what I mean? A UCLA gets the best prepared students around. Well, you probably already had a textbook for this period in AP European History. Somebody who raised their hand, tell me what your textbook was in AP European History. Yes, what is your name?
Austin.
Austin? Yeah. Okay. McKay? McKay. How many used McKay? It's a kind of social history textbook. One of our competitors has just been bought by Bedford Books, which publishes my textbook, too. What other textbooks did people use besides McKay in AP European History? No one can remember the name of the author of their textbook because it went in and out so quickly and made so little impression. What is your name? Alex. Spielvogel, best-selling textbook for Western civilization by one author. Problem with a one-authored textbook, and the reason ours has 5, is no one person knows everything from, as we say, Plato to NATO. That's what we used to say, when NATO really mattered, and when we thought history began with the Greeks. Now, of course, we know it goes back to before the Greeks and goes considerably after the foundation of NATO in the post-World War II period. Okay, so for me, the textbook is there to give you background. We will let you know which facts you need to know. We are not here to try to catch you out on something you didn't memorize. We're not that interested in memorization. We do think it's important to know which century World War II is in. Which century the French Revolution is in, harder. Which century the Enlightenment is in. So we want you to know a general chronological order, but we want you to think about what does the coming of the modern world mean? What is it about? And so that is what we are going to talk about. And so I have to play you, I hope this doesn't ruin my whole presentation, one of my favorite clips. Okay, I should have done that on, I would have been happier if I'd done that on YouTube. Okay, so I am not handing out a print version of the syllabus. I could say it's to save trees. It's also because then you throw them away and you have to consult the one online anyway. If anyone has trouble printing out their syllabus or viewing the syllabus online, let me know and I will print one out for you. Other details. Some people are waitlisted for this course. What you should try to do is email the TA of the section you want to get into, or I'm hoping that after class today, the TAs will come down here and meet with people who want to get into their sections. There is one section that has, it's a Wednesday section, I think it's the noon Wednesday section, that has 5 people waitlisted. All 5 people are not going to get into the Wednesday section. If you're waitlisted for a section that you're the only person waitlisted, you might have a chance of getting into the section. So come after class, those of you who haven't been emailing me already, and try to meet with the TA of the section that you're interested in. And if that doesn't work, email me and I'll get in touch with the person who's in charge of the section and get you in touch with them. Those of you who are interested in doing the honors contract, if you haven't already talked to me, come and talk to me after class today. Okay, We're going to go over a few things on the syllabus in just a minute. But first, cell phones. If your cell phone goes off, do not panic. I am not going to run over to you, these steps are too steep anyway, and say you are a bad person. Just turn off the ringer so that we don't have to hear it. It happens all the time. I have to tell you, once, we have a committee of professors in the department who visits other professors' classes just to see how things are going. The last time I had my class visited, it was only a class of 45 or 50, and the person who was there to evaluate my class had her cell phone go off in the middle of class. It can happen to anybody. We will not consider this a grave offense. Okay, a few more details that we need to go over. The syllabus is pretty clear. All of the reading on the syllabus is required. You have to attend the lectures. Basically, the in-class quiz once a week will constitute taking attendance. You absolutely have to attend sections where attendance will be taken directly by the teaching assistant. And I made it quite clear that you get a lower grade if you miss more than one section without some kind of medical excuse. So there's going to be quizzes in class. You know that there are 3 papers, but they're short papers. The first paper is especially short, and it's based on a small amount of reading. My sense of the reading, and you will tell me what you think as you go along, my sense of the reading is that it's not wildly demanding until you get to the very end, or sort of close to the end. And the one really long thing to read that you should start ahead of time is the Hannah Arendt piece on Eichmann and Jerusalem. Eichmann and Jerusalem, you might say, why? You might ask, why did I assign the things that we have assigned in addition to the documents and the textbook? Marx, you can't understand the modern world unless you have actually read Marx. So you're going to read a few pages of the opening of the Communist Manifesto. I picked Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, because it really gets efficiently to the question of Europe's relationship to its imperial ambitions and the colonies it takes over. How many people read Conrad in high school? Oh my God. Oh, that's so horrible. Practically everybody read Conrad. Okay, so then you're in really great shape. How many of you had to write a paper on Conrad in high school? Oh my God. Forget Conrad, we're not going to do that in the future. Okay, so you're going to have a really easy time. Conrad's only 100 pages long, which is why everyone likes to assign it. And it comes, as you know, if you've gone to the bookstore, with the books for the course at basically no extra price. Or if you're getting the ebook version of the textbook, you can get it online. And that's going to be a 2-page paper. Eichmann and Jerusalem. How many people read Eichmann and Jerusalem in high school? Right. Okay. So we'll graduate to the harder readings as we go along. Eichmann and Jerusalem is 300 pages long, so don't leave it till the end. We'll try to signal to you what are the parts that you most need to concentrate on. Eichmann and Jerusalem is an incredibly controversial book about basically the reasons for the Holocaust. And we will linger on that question for one whole lecture, and then you will write a paper on Eichmann and Jerusalem. And the interesting thing about Arendt is that it gets to some of the general themes in the course about the meaning of modernity, that she was one of the great writers about this question, which we will talk about more. Okay, syllabus. Now we'll see if this will work. It did. I'm so happy. You all know how to find the syllabus on the web. What we don't have up yet is the emails for the teaching assistants. The syllabus is down here. We are converting in the social sciences to a new system called Moodle. You might be familiar with it if you've taken classes in the humanities. They have been using it sooner. The social sciences designed its own class templates in the past. A member of our department took the lead in designing the previous class templates. We're switching over to Moodle, which is a free software available to universities. And they asked me to do this because they know I like to fool around with computer stuff, and they needed a few volunteers to start the transition. So you're part of the volunteers, whether you wanted to be, of the transition. The virtue of Moodle is that right on the front page you have the syllabus, but you also have it broken down into week-by-week readings. So the reading for every week is up here, and where there are connections to web-based things, they will be here. If there are especially good things that I think you might want to look at, URLs for something interesting, I'll put them up as we go along. But in addition, you'll be able to, at any moment, find out what you need to do for this week, but you'll also be able to see the syllabus as a whole once the PDF finally, oh my. Okay, the syllabus as a whole. So you've already seen this. I'm not going to repeat all the various things in it. The reading, I think, is pretty clearly laid out. And if you have any questions about it, let me know. There's also a link on the syllabus to the online study guide that comes with the textbook that gives you map exercises and visual exercises. As you will see in just a minute, I will also be talking about at least one image from the period that's in the textbook each lecture to sort of show how it relates to the issues. The map quizzes are sort of fun, so do them if that appeals to you. They may help you with the class, with the in-class quizzes. Okay, how to read the textbook. I've brought here an online picture of the end of each chapter has a review section that can be helpful in preparing for the exams. So when you get to the end, at the very end, you see it. There's a chapter review that has the key terms, that gives you the page number where the terms are described, gives you some questions to use to review, and gives you important dates. We will not ask an identification question that isn't in either the key terms and peoples or important dates. So those are the summary of the possible things that you would need to know about when we get to the exams. Okay. Similarly, the last map at the end of each chapter is there to kind of provide a summary of important things for you to consider about the chapter. So this is the one at the end of the first chapter we're reading, locates the various countries that you might be asked about on a map quiz, puts it in the context of the Atlantic, and shows you how already in the 18th century, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, all have important colonies in the New World and in the New World, and also locates for you the Ottoman Empire, which comes up in the textbook frequently. We're not going to have a lot of time to talk about it, but it's an important element in the story of modernity and the West. Okay, this is the opening picture in the chapter that you're reading for this week. This is a picture by a Danish artist of Catherine the Great. So one of the things I want you to do when you're reading the textbook is to ask these questions. This question, not the question I have up here, but the bottom question. Why start a chapter on the Enlightenment with Catherine the Great? Are we starting with Catherine the Great just out of mindless political correctness to show that women matter in history too? We will talk about that on Thursday. But I want to point out something that you can help me with. When I went to get a picture on the web that matched the picture in the textbook, this was the first thing I came up with. Now, do you notice something that is problematic about this picture? You probably haven't been studying the picture that's in the textbook. I will remind you. Is there something that you would notice about the difference in these pictures. What's your name again? Is it Austin, yeah. No, look generally. This is not a trick question. This is not a question. This is not a question about what she's wearing, which I'm going to talk about on Thursday. This is a very, very, what's your name? Minoj, yeah, okay. It's flipped. Exactly. So the question is, which is the right picture? This is I saw this, when I got this on the web, I was like panic-stricken. In fact, I was so panic-stricken. Oh, no. Okay. Because we just installed Windows Media Player, it now wants me to go out of the program and back in again. So I'm not going to do that. What I will do is tell you the story instead. I saw this, and I looked at the picture on the textbook, and I said, these are flipped. Which is right? I was so worried about this that I actually called the production manager at Bedford Books, and I said, we have this picture backwards. How did this happen? And they said, no, we don't. We had an art research company, came up with this, and this is the right way. So then I went on the web and I looked at every single possible version of this picture and discovered that even the Hermitage Museum, where the main version of this picture exists, has it both ways on its websites. So it's in fact the way it is in the textbook, I believe. But you would not be able to resolve this. But if you see a picture, the point is, if you see a picture that's flipped from what you've seen on the web, let me know, because this is one of the most common errors in the age of mechanical reproduction. So when you look at start with the picture at the beginning of the chapter and ask yourself, why is this picture there? Similarly, ask yourself, why is this chapter set up the way it is set up? We want to ask questions here. Now, when you read a textbook, especially when you read a textbook in high school, you read McKay or Spielvogel, and you thought, this is just the truth of what happened in this period of time. Textbooks, print has a way of making it seem like this is just the way it is. So that's the kind of question you want to ask yourself. You want to say, why is this chapter organized in the way it is? What are the choices the writers are making? So in the first chapter we're reading, for example, this starts with men and women of the Enlightenment and their ideas. Is the implication then that ideas drive history? Other chapters will start differently. And in fact, one of our goals was precisely not to follow the same pattern in every time period. Not to start with economics, and then society, and then politics, and then ideas. But instead, to argue that in some time periods, ideas really matter a lot. And the Enlightenment is one of those time periods. But as we'll see on Thursday, and here's where we get back to Handel, ideas only work if there is a public for them. And one of the things about Handel's invention of the oratorio in 1741 was that it was part of a new public culture that was developing. The oratorio is interesting. Now, he did this for the court in the first instance, but if you think back to the picture of Colin Davis and the London Symphony Orchestra, there is a huge chorus. There is an increasingly huge orchestra. The orchestra in the early 18th century is still fairly small, but it's getting bigger. Now, what is the implication of that? What does it mean that you have a big chorus and an increasingly large orchestra? Where could you do something like Handel's Messiah? Could you do it in a prince's living room? You might be able to do it, and in fact, of course, it is always done, often done in churches, because it is a religious piece of music. So churches are still commissioning music. Princes and rulers are still commissioning music. But one of the new facts of the 18th century is that the very first public concerts are given starting at the beginning of the 18th century in Germany and in England. You have, before 1700, there are no paid musical concerts. You did not buy a ticket and go to a hall and listen to music. You did buy tickets for one form of music invented in the 17th century, which already had a public, and that was the opera. The opera was the most popular form of music in the 17th century. I know you find that hard to believe now, but this is one of the things we will talk about, is how the public for music changes over time and what it tells us about the structure of society, and as we will see, the structure of politics. There is no French Revolution possible, I would argue, until you have public musical concerts. And I will explain how that is. It is not because of the music that people are listening to. It is because a public is forming. People are beginning to come together for cultural events. Again, I'll talk about this more on Thursday. Another one of those events is art exhibitions. We take museums totally for granted today. There were no public museums before the end of the 18th century, but starting in the early 18th century, rulers began to have expositions of art in their palaces open to the public. So we have the beginning of the public exhibition, the public concert, and as we will see on Thursday, this is intimately related to the appearance of the daily newspaper, which does not exist before the end of the 17th, early 18th century, and especially for political reasons, the coffee house, which also arises in the 18th century. So, why start the chapters in the way we do? So each chapter, say to yourself, what is the structure of the chapter about? Why start about men and women and their ideas? And how else could you explain it? And what are the implications for historical interpretation? What can we conclude about the meaning of history from this? Okay, now some of the big themes. And a little word on how Arendt will fit into them later. I see this course as having two big themes. One is the West, and the other is modernity. Well, it's really one theme, which is why is what we call modernity associated with the West? Very much so still today. But that means taking apart these terms. What does it mean to refer to the West? Well, first of all, the notion of Western civilization, which is kind of a little bit up in the air these days. Notice the titles. I can't remember what the title. What is the title of McKay? You said you used it, Austin. It's like society. Yes. Western societies, I think is what it is, right? Western societies. Everyone's a little nervous about using the term Western civilization. Now, why would that be? Why would there be nervousness about using the term Western civilization? What is your name? Kelly? It implies that the rest of the world right. It's invidious. It implies some people have civilization. Well, of course, Western civilization doesn't necessarily mean there isn't Eastern civilization, because in fact, there are courses about Eastern civilizations, but there's this sense that maybe some people are not civilized or don't have a sophisticated civilization. Okay, so notice the title of our book is not Western Civilization. It's The Making of the West, Peoples and Cultures. The problem with the new titles of Western Civ textbooks is no one can ever remember the title. I have trouble remembering my own title, even though I helped make it up. And almost everybody I know who writes textbooks, if you ask them, what's the title of your textbook? They say, I think it has West in it, but other than that, no one is entirely sure. Okay. So, what is the West about? The notion that there was such a thing called Western civilization is a product of World War I and World War II. There was no Western civilization course in any American university before World War I. Okay? So, does that mean there was no Western civilization before World War I? Other important fact. Western civilization is not a subject taught in any European university. It is an American idea. So the question is, why do we have this idea of Western civilization? We have this idea, it was a product of World War I and World War II, because it was a part of saying the United States is inseparably linked with Europe. Does someone know, when did World War I started in 1914. When did the United States enter World War I? 1917, 3 years later. There was enormous opposition to entering the war. One reason was that the biggest immigrant community in the United States at that time was Germans. The biggest immigrant group in the United States in the early 20th century, by far, was Germans. So why should we be linked with England and France against Germany? Many people said. World War II started in 1939. When did we enter World War II? Very end of December 1941. Again, enormous resistance. So in some ways one could say Western civilization as an idea is political propaganda, to be harsh about it. It's political propaganda that says the US is linked to Europe. We may be independent from the British, but our values, our culture, our politics are linked to Europe, and in particular, the number one value that is cited in this linkage is democratic forms of government. So, you get the notion of the West, and it gets tied, first of all, to a political similarity. You have representative forms of government. Now, the truth of the matter is, of course, that in Europe, even today, many countries are monarchies. But they have representative institutions. They have democratically elected parliaments, diets, assemblies, whatever they're called. It depends from country to country. So democracy, representative government. And then the issue for some people was, well, is it also capitalism? This became especially an important issue after World War II, because in the fight between the free world and communism, an element of the free world was free markets, the ability of capital to develop. So then that became associated as well with the West. And more recently, especially after World War II, although I've written a book about its 18th century origins recently, it is also the notion of human rights. Is that a Western notion, or is it a universal notion? Many of those who champion the idea of Western civilization would say that human rights has its origins in the West. It may be universal now, the way democracy is universal now, but it has its origins in the West. Okay, so Western civilization, not an entirely neutral concept. Similarly, the West, not an entirely neutral concept. Because in fact, we can only talk about the West in opposition to something else. Most commonly in the 19th and 20th century, this was in opposition to the East. And we have then in the rise in the 19th century of what is called Orientalism, thinking of the non-West as somehow, getting back to Kelly's point, as somehow lesser. That the West is superior because it has superior values, superior politics, superior technology, we will see in the 19th and 20th century. Increasingly, of course, now the West is juxtaposed to Islam. There is the Christian West as opposed to the other religions in the rest of the world, the most important of them being Islam. So is the West opposed to Islam, to non-Christians, to the third world? In short, is there the West, and as we say, sort of somewhat self-mockingly in our own history department, the West and the rest of the world? What do we call, what should we be calling the rest of the world? Just to remind you the fact that there is a rather large world out there, and this is a map from earlier, from a chapter that's not in our version of it. This is from the previous chapter in the textbook, just to show you how much Europe is involved with the rest of the world already in 1740. There are links to all the other continents, whether that link is by slavery, with slaves being taken from Africa to South America, to the Caribbean islands, and of course to British North America, or goods. There has been a kind of global market for goods already, certainly by 1740, but the main engine of that global market was the West. Okay, so one question is, should we drop this idea of the West? And what are we really talking about when we talk about the West? Originally, the World War I, World War II idea of Western civilization was Europe and its relationship to the United States. Western civ textbooks in my day didn't even mention the United States, however. We were just being meant to learn about Europe so we would see our kinship with them. Now you will see that the United States is in the Western civ textbook. But the issue is it even the United States and Europe? Is it the G8 or is it the G20? The G20 includes Brazil, for example. And it also includes, help me now, does G20 include India? Yes, and does it include China? Yes. So the West is not really anymore a distinctive area. We're going to be talking primarily about Europe in this course, but we want to think about, does this what globalization means then? Is it the developed world as opposed to what is euphemistically called the developing world? All of these things enter into the discussion, and we need to keep in mind, as Kelly reminded us from the beginning, that there's the issue of invidious comparison, that some people are better than others. Okay, but then more problematically still comes the notion of modernity. Now, I've done a little bit of research on this myself. I asked myself, so when did people start talking about modernity? Did they talk about it in the Roman Empire? Did they talk about it in the Middle Ages? In fact, thinking of that, this is something I became very interested in. When did people start referring to Rome and Greece as ancient? I can assure you that no one in Rome or Greece in, let's say, the 3rd century AD thought of themselves as ancient. They thought of themselves as just as much now as we think of ourselves as now. So where did we get this ancient, medieval, modern distinction? Where did this come about? Well, it came about in stages. In the 15th century, during the Renaissance, increasingly thinkers referred to Greece and Rome as the ancients. They were the models to be revived in the new Renaissance version of the world. And increasingly in the Renaissance, they began to speak of the Dark Ages, the period right after Rome, which meant a period when there was no light in the world, not physically speaking, but intellectually speaking. And increasingly in the 16th and 17th century, thinkers referred to the Middle Ages. Now, what is the Middle Ages, the middle between? It is the middle between the ancients and what, by the end of the 17th century, in fact, right about the time that we're starting this course, increasingly is referred to as the moderns. There, in fact, was a quarrel at the end of the 17th century, referred to as the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. Should we be following the model set out by Plato and Aristotle, who were, after all, two of the greatest thinkers of all times? Or should we be relying on new knowledge gained through science and gained through scientific understandings of the world? The modern, then, is a concept deeply associated with what we're going to be talking about on Thursday, the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment calls itself the Enlightenment, at least it does so by the 1780s, famously. And the term itself gives you an idea of its view of history. Before the 18th century was darkness. Starting in the 18th century is light. New light thrown on old and new problems. What happens in the 18th century then is a valorization of the present and the future over the past. Now, this is extremely difficult for us to grasp its unbelievably fundamental character for our understanding of the world ourselves. Because we think, I would say 99% of the time, in terms of the present and the future. Going to the university is about being oriented to the future. It's an Enlightenment idea. That if you learn things, you will be able to control your own future. This is the definition of the modern. This is a new idea at the end of the 17th and early 18th century, that the modern period is going to be superior to what came before. Because of knowledge, because of technology gained through knowledge, because of control of nature gained through knowledge, and we will talk about this on Thursday. I just want to underline to you today how deep-rooted this notion of modernity is in our minds. We think of ourselves all the time as modern, and the problem with the notion of modernity is that it immediately sets up precisely those kinds of invidious distinctions. Let's think about that. What is the not modern? How would we characterize it? What would be the words, the adjectives? Don't say unmodern, I know. Okay. Modern as opposed to, antiquity, old, yes, modern as opposed to old, but what else? Modern as opposed to, are you going to tell me an answer? Traditional. Exactly. What is your name? Kevin. Perfect. Modern as opposed to traditional. What's traditional is no longer good just because it's always been that way. Try to think of this. This is what cracks a nut about cultural values. It's no longer good enough to have always been that way. Because there's always been slavery, slavery is not right. Because women have always been subjugated to their husbands is not necessarily mean that they are right. Because gays have never had rights before is no longer a reason for why they should not have them now. The past no longer justifies the present. Okay, traditional is a very important one. What else? What else would be a contrast with the modern? Yes, what is your name? Kirsten?
I'd say savage.
Savage, well, that would be savage, civilized. Yes, I mean, we wouldn't want to say Aristotle and Plato are savage. But what would be some of the others? How about backward? Okay? The notion of time that goes with the modern is that you're going forward. The not modern is behind. So you see how time gets turned into space. There are the modern countries and the traditional countries, the advanced countries and the backward countries, the forward-looking and the backward-looking. And we get a problem about how other people in the world are viewed, and we get one of the biggest cultural issues of our day, in which there are many people who say, sometimes with very good reason, what is so great about modernity? You can't get down the 405, great superhighway, because there are so many cars on it. There's violence, there's suicide, there's unhappiness, there's alienation, there's no sense of rootedness, there's no sense of community, there are no cultural values, everything's up in the air. There are plenty of criticisms of modernity. So we have here a key issue that we're going to be talking about. Now, what are the elements of modernity that we're going to talk about in this class? Oh, see, I had traditional and backward right up there. You can read. I'm so glad. Oh. I've got to look at the screen occasionally. Okay. As you see, there are three main elements that I see as defining modernity. And they are the three, well, three is maybe too many. Two, the first two, will be laid out clearly in the Enlightenment. Now, of course, one of the problems with this course is Thursday we're going to do the entire Enlightenment in one 75-minute lecture. There are whole courses on the Enlightenment in this university. So try to think of it as 10 weeks compressed into 75 minutes. I have a tendency to talk fast, so if I'm going too fast when we go to the Enlightenment, you must stop me and say, wait, I think I missed 50 years. It went by while I was thinking about something else. I was sending a text message, and somehow we're at 1780, and I thought we were at 1750. Stop me. Okay. The Enlightenment lays out the first two elements of modernity. One is reason as the standard of truth. Now, again, these ideas are the ideas that we take for granted. Therefore, we don't see them as having a historical origin. Reason as the standard of truth, as the key to knowledge. What does this mean? This means using your own brain and what you can do through experiment, as taught by the scientific revolution, to unlock the secrets of nature, including human nature, including society, and politics. Now, for us, this is like, sliced bread. Not exactly a novelty. We take it for granted. This is a huge issue in the 18th century in Europe and the United States because it is quite quickly seen as a battle between the secular and the religious. The Bible is not the standard of truth. Religious authority is not the standard of truth. And indeed, political authority is not the standard of truth. The only thing that's true is what can be proved to be true to the satisfaction of your reason. This will be the subject of an enormous struggle in the 18th century. Less of a struggle in the 19th and 20th century, although we still see that this is a huge issue today, still. Is the use of birth control right or not? If you're a Catholic and follow the teachings of the Pope, you would have one view of this. You might have a different view if you're not from that religious tradition. How do we adjudicate these issues? Are they questions of faith or are they questions of reason? We will see that this is a subject of great conflict in the 18th century as we talk about it on Thursday. Those who believed that reason was the standard of truth came over the course of the 18th century to believe in ideas laid out earlier, especially by John Locke at the end of the 17th century, that individuals had rights. Now, again, we take this so for granted today that we have a hard time seeing that this could even be a subject of discussion. But it still is a subject of discussion. What should take priority? The right of the individual or the right of the nation? The nation claims the right to lock up some people if they see them as threats. Are there limits on that? We have recently been having big discussions about this. What are the limits on the government's powers in a time of national emergency? What should take priority? The abortion debate tells us that this is not an easily resolved issue. Does the right of the woman who is pregnant take priority? Or does the right of the fetus take priority? And at what stage? But we have these debates because we have come to see the notion that rights inhere in the individual. And we will talk a bit on Thursday, but we won't have very much time to do it, about how that happened. How it came to be that the individual had rights, as opposed just to the family or the community having rights, and what the consequences of this would be. This has enormous implications for how people are treated, for example, who are arrested and convicted. We still have huge debates about, for example, capital punishment. No European country has capital punishment. We have capital punishment, so obviously re-resolve the question about what rights are in a different way from the Europeans. And then thirdly, democracy. This will begin to emerge at the end of the 18th century. The notion that if individuals have rights, prime amongst those rights are the right to participate in the political sphere. Again, we take this for granted. Most of you presumably voted in the last election. There was no voting in national elections. First of all, there were no national elections in any country except England at the end of the 17th century. There were no national elections, period. There were only local elections. Needless to say, women did not get the vote until the 20th century in any of the major European or the United States, the European countries or the United States. Women didn't get the right to vote in some parts of Switzerland until the 1970s, and women don't have the right to vote everywhere in the world yet today. So exactly who was allowed to participate in politics would become the subject of the 19th and 20th centuries. So democracy follows from the question of rights, because if an individual has rights, The first definition of rights was about how you should be able to express yourself. Freedom of religion, first of the rights that came up. Freedom of expression, freedom of the free speech, second of the rights that comes up. Freedom, the right not to be tortured, third right that comes up. And only the right to vote comes up as the fourth in line of these rights towards the end of the 18th century. So there's a kind of progression, and that progression is still very much on our minds today. Who has full rights? Do you get rights when you're 21 or when you're 18? Which rights do you get when you're 21 or 18? What kind of person do you have to be to have rights? You have to be able to reason. You do not have rights if you are locked up in an asylum. And you lose rights if you're in prison. So you have to be able to use reason, and you have to have autonomy. You have to be able to decide for yourself in order for these rights to really work. So one of the things that will happen with the Enlightenment is, not surprisingly, an enormous emphasis on education. You are here today as a result of those struggles. Only men went to the university in the 18th century, and only elite men went to the university in the 18th century. And in most of Europe, the only thing you studied in the university in the 18th century was medicine, law, or theology, especially theology. The world is a very different place now, in part because of those struggles. But they all involve, where does authority come from? Does it come from the individual deciding for him or herself, or does it come from someplace outside the individual? And then finally, starting even already at the end of the 19th century, but certainly in the 20th century, will be the challenges to the notion of modernity. And without question, the event that causes the most discussion of modernity for those who live in the West is the Holocaust. How could this unparalleled example of barbarism take place in the 20th century when there's democracy, supposedly? Well, not for women, but for men. When everyone supposedly believes in science, when everybody believes in reason, and how can it happen in the country known for its culture, known for its cultural sophistication? How can the country that produced Luther, Bach, Beethoven, for that matter, Einstein is not, he's actually Swiss originally, but he's a German speaker, Freud, this is the country that brings the killing of 6 million Jews and countless others as well, through scientific means, using railroads to send people to camps, and gas chambers invented to kill people. This is what modernity leads to. This will be the great question. This was the question that is on Arendt's mind, Hannah Arendt's mind, for her entire life. She herself being a German Jew who escapes to France, works for a Zionist organization, and then becomes critical of Zionism after she moves to the United States, where she is a philosophy professor in New York City until her death. She is, as were many German refugees, obsessed with the question, how could this happen in an advanced country, in a civilized country, in a modern country? How could all those things that were supposedly so great about modernity have led to death camps. Now, there have been plenty of questions about modernity since then, raised by other parts of the world. What has Western imperialism done to the rest of the world? Are the values of the West, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, airplanes, video games, well, I guess you have to include Japan there in the West if we go that far. Are all these things so great? Does everybody have to embrace the same values that the West has embraced over time? Is secularization a good thing? Or is there something to be said for traditional values? Those are the kinds of questions that we will deal with in this class. Most of the time, we will deal with them right until the last minute of 11 o'clock, because I'll be desperately trying to get in 80 years of history in one lecture. But today, you get to leave early. People with questions about sections, come down here and try to resolve them.